So in the last video, I showed you one of my favorite film stocks recently. And whenever I go on a trip and bring some film and a digital camera, I try to take them side by side so that when I come home, I can try to mimic the film. One of my favorite things about Fujifilm cameras is the ability to create a lot of different looks in camera. Starting with the base of the film simulation and adding in things like grain, chrome effect, white balance shift, you can create different looks straight out of camera that are unique and look great in different conditions. Now, one thing I'll say about film recipes is that trying to mimic actual film stocks is really difficult to achieve. And I found that the hardest part is getting the white balance correct and consistent. Most of the time it might work in one lighting condition, like for example, sunny, but not in another condition like being cloudy. I've made several night recipes that are consistent because lighting is more controlled than during the day. So in today's video, I'm sharing my Fuji 100 recipe that I have found to be my most accurate and consistent recipe that mimics a film stock in daylight. And I think it looks pretty good at night too. I shot 12 rolls of Fujicolor 100 last year, and nearly every time I applied my recipe, it almost exactly matched the film shot. It has now become my go-to recipe. So I'm going to show you each of the locations I shot side by side of the film versus digital film recipe, as well as what the original digital shot looked like in the standard Astia Film Simulation. And later in the video, I'm going to give you 3 recipe settings. One that matches the film, one with DRP or dynamic range priority settings, and one for video. So let's dive in. First, I want to show you my very first roll of Fujicolor 100 and how I went back and matched it with the Fujicolor 100 recipe. Here's what the original image looked like with the Astia Film Simulation and how it looks with the Fujicolor 100 recipe. Versus here's what it looks like side by side with the recipe and the film stock. I think they look pretty close. Obviously you could tell the recipe is a little bit darker, but we'll get into that more later and how you can fix that. One thing that'll become apparent is how Astia has a very blue look to it. The sky is often blue and everything feels a little bit cooler. Versus the recipe, much like the original film stock, has a warmer look to it even when it's an overcast day like this. Again, here you can see just how deep the blues of both the water and the sky are, versus the recipe makes them more of a baby blue. And here's the film stock and you can see they both look very similar to each other. Next, I'll share a couple of comparisons from Mexico. This is the first photo where I really tried to get the recipe right. I loved how the blues and the greens turned out in the recipe and how similar they are to the film stock. The biggest difference I think you can see in this image is that in the film there's a little bit more magenta in the clouds versus it's pure white in the recipe. In this image, my favorite part that changes is if you look at the reds in that boat and inside of the boat, the blues. I love those two colors versus the original version of the Astia. Again, I think the recipe very closely resembles the original look of the film stock. Here you can see that the lizard and the feathers of the parrot are very blue, versus on the Fujicolor 100 recipe has a little bit more of a teal or turquoise look to it, which is how it looks in the original film stock. I think this image shows again why I like the recipe more. The water and the sky in the recipe have this very deep turquoise look to it that I really like. It makes the scene feel so vibrant and rich, like a warm memory. Now I'll show you a couple of comparisons in Maui. When I first started shooting on Fujifilm digital cameras, I really liked how the blues rendered. But after shooting analog photography, I've started to lean more towards really liking that baby blue look in the sky and in the water. While the blue of Astia may look more normal or natural to the human eye, I find myself preferring and liking the analog blue look more. I think the recipe really shines here because it really accentuates the colors of the volcano more. Your eye is more drawn to the blacks, reds, and browns in this photo. Now we'll look at a couple of comparisons from my trip to South Dakota. last, I want to show you a few comparisons of my trip to Colombia, but also a new setting I started to use, which is the DRP Strong setting. So here you can see Fujicolor next to the recipe that I have been sharing. But on this trip, I started testing out the DRP Strong setting, which gives it a much more flat and even look. So here's both versions of the recipe with DRP Strong turned on versus it turned off. With it turned off, you can see it has much more natural contrast with darker shadows and brighter highlights. But I kind of like the dreamy look of the DRP Strong. And here's what it looks like with the original Astia simulation. It feels pretty dull and flat to me, and I much prefer the recipe. Here you can see the recipe very closely resembles the original shot. And with DRP Strong turned on, the contrast doesn't look the same, but the color palette overall kind of does. Overall, I'm curious to hear what you think, if you like the DRP Strong turned on or turned off. Now, I do love this film recipe and use it in many situations. I do want to show you one example where it doesn't work and when I turned it off. When I traveled to Colombia, there was this really beautiful town called Guatapé that had all these beautiful pastels of purples and pinks that just didn't go well with the film simulation. So I decided to go with Reala Ace, the standard film simulation on the Fuji camera. So here's my recipe settings for Fujicolor 100, all the different photo settings. First, it is made for X100VI sensors, so that includes like X-H2S, X-T5, the XS20, the X100 Mark VI, and like the new XM5. You want to use the film simulation classic negative, grain on strong and small, color chrome effect and color chrome blue effect on weak, and white balance set to auto, with the white balance shift set to red +3 and blue -5. The standard version of the recipe is set to DR100. But more on that in my next settings later. The other thing too I noticed with this recipe is you want to put your exposure compensation usually at +2/3. Sometimes +1/3 all the way up to 1 full stop, but I found that the sweet spot for me was +2/3. Highlight and shadow both at -1, color at +4, sharpness at -1, and high ISO noise reduction at -4. I set the clarity at 0, but if you want to add some softness, you could add some negative clarity at 2 or 3. Or I would often shoot with either a 1/8 or 1/4 black pro mist. Now, if you want that more dreamy flat look of DRP Strong, here are my settings for that. The only 4 settings that really change is setting the dynamic range to DRP Strong. You can play with the exposure compensation some more, and then highlight and shadow are not options when you set it to DRP Strong. All the other settings remain the same. Here's again what those two looks look like. I also wanted to give you a little bit of a note about how the DRP priority settings work. This is important if you want to go back later and change settings in Fuji X-RAW Studio, because DRP Strong is the only RAW setting that you cannot change in Fuji X-RAW Studio later after you shoot it. So here's what I mean. You have to set your setting at DRP Strong if you want to be able to later change it to DRP Weak, DR400, DR200, or DR100. If you set your settings to DRP Weak, you cannot go up to DRP Strong. You can only keep it there or go down to 400, 200, or 100. The same is true if you set your settings to DR200. You can only set it there or go down to DR100. You cannot go back up. So if you want the look on the left, you have to set your DRP Strong setting in camera before you shoot it. Now I wanted to give you the video settings that I use for the Fujicolor 100 recipe. Most of the available settings are the same. You can see a couple that are crossed out. Those are only photo settings, but I did make a few adjustments. First, I set the DR to DR400 because I want to have the most dynamic range possible. Next, I usually add a little bit of exposure compensation, somewhere between 1/3 and a full stop. Next, I put the highlights to -2 and the shadows to -2. Again, the reason I do this is I want the flattest image possible so I can later add in contrast if I want to. The last 3 settings are the same as they were in the photo recipe. In the next video, I'm going to share the trip that I took to Colombia with my Fujifilm X100 Mark VI, sharing my favorite photos and videos shot mostly with this Fuji 100 recipe. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this recipe video. I'd love to see what you capture with it. Reach out to me on Instagram if you do, and we'll see you on the next one.